Hello everyone, welcome to JFORJS. In this particular question, we have to use the concept of memoize. I will explain you through an example, then we will go into the question. So here, let's assume that we have a function called factorial. Okay, so what is a factorial function? A factorial function is usually takes a number n and then it returns n into n minus 1, then it returns n minus 2, then multiplied by n minus 3 and so forth till 1, right? This is the value of a factorial function. We can simply write this function using recursion or using for loop. Both are fine. But one simple understanding we need to find out here is, so let's say if I am calculating a factorial of 5, right? Factorial of 5. A factorial of 5 can be written as 5 multiplied by 4 multiplied by 3 multiplied by 2 multiplied by 1, right? This is one approach. The other approach is we can simply write a factorial of 5 into 5 into factorial of 4. Okay, factorial of 4. So in this scenario, we are using recursion. A factorial of 5 can be written as 5 into factorial of 4. And this factorial 4 can be represented as 4 into factorial of 3 and so on. So definitely we need a checking condition here. We need an exit condition for our recursion. Here is like if my n is greater than, if my n is equals to 1, then simply return 1. Else you should always go with this approach, right? Else you can always go with this approach. So now this factorial function is complete. I will show you one more understanding of this memoize function. So for example, let's say if I am calculating a factorial of 170, which is a very huge number, right? So I have to multiply all these numbers, right? From 170 to I have to multiply 169, right? I have to multiply 169 and so on. So it will be a huge number and there will be a huge calculation. And let's say what will happen if I call this function again with, let's say, the value of 170 one more time, okay, then it has to calculate the whole value one more time because we are not using a concept of memoize. It means what if any calculation this function is ever doing or the result this function is returning, we can store it in some kind of a memory. And if the inputs are same, we can check whether this particular information is already there in our memory, then directly return. If not, then do the calculation, right? So for example, in this scenario, if I am calculating 170 here, this must be returning some value, right? It must return some value. It must return some value till, let's say, 1, right? And if I store this whole value into some variable, and next time when somebody calls factorial of 170, I can check in my memory and get the value. So this will help us in reducing the number of calculations, the number of calls we are doing in a function, right? For example, similarly, we have this function called sum, and if a and b, both the numbers are passed, we need to return simply a plus b. But if I'm going to call this a one more time, then we should not do this calculation. We should check in our DB or our in-memory database, and from there we have to pick the value and return it. This way we can reduce the number of calls, reduce the number of logics which has to be calculated by our CPU, right? So how do we implement all those things? Let me remove these things. And one more time here we will understand from here. So we need to write a function called memoize which returns a memoized function. Okay, so if this function is being called here, this function is being passed here, it will return the memoized version of this whole function. Okay, it means if I am calling with the same value one more time, it should not call that function. Okay, it should directly return the value which is being stored in our DB. So in general, a function does not store any value. But in JavaScript, as we know, right, if we want to maintain some kind of a state, we can use the concept of closure. So here in our memoize function, we are returning one more function. So we can use, or this is already using a concept of closure. So this is very simple. We are going to create our DB, create a database. Okay, so this is not a typical database like Oracle or MySQL. This is just a variable which will hold our value. So let's create a variable called DB, which is a normal object. Okay, which is a normal object. Any one of these things. First, what we will do, we will call our function. We'll call our function with these arguments. Okay, and whatever is the value we are getting it, whatever is the value we are getting it, we will store it in our DB. How do we store? So we will write DB and we will use these arguments as our key. Okay, we will use these arguments as our key. So ARGS. So these arguments as a key, it means if somebody is again passing 1 and 2, so this DB 1, 2 will be our key and the value will be stored here. Okay, and from here we are going to return DB of ARGS. Okay, so what we are doing here, we are calculating it one time, we are storing it in our in-memory DB and we are returning it. This will not solve a purpose because every time any number you are calling, it is gonna calculate this fn, then store it in the DB and returns it. But if I add a condition here, if the arguments is already in the DB, it means this key arguments is already in the DB. We have already seen these type of arguments earlier. Then we just have to make a check. So if this arguments is in DB, it means this arguments key exists in DB, then let's return the value from the DB. So whenever we return something, the below line of code will not execute, right? One more time. So this memoize function is returning another function. Before that, we create a database. Database here is just a variable which is an object. So we go inside here. Let's write this line first. So we are calculating fn based on these arguments, storing this value in our database and then returning the value. Okay, returning the stored value. But after, let's say, one more time you are calling the same function. So here we are checking if my arguments is in the DB. It means we have already seen this DB already knows about these type of arguments. Then return the value which is being stored in the DB. That's it. Let's run. So all our test cases are passed and let's submit. Okay, so it's accepting all the test cases as well.